Let's just dive right into this, guys. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking at one of the absolute most remarkable stories in modern retail history. And, if you think you already know the story of Starbucks, you might kind of want to think again. We are going to unpack the intense friction, the staggering amount of rejection, and the absolute near collapse that almost took down a global coffee empire. We'll explore the anatomy of a massive brand turnaround driven by one singular vision and the incredible lengths one leader went to just to protect it. So, let's get into it. To kick things off, I want you to honestly ask yourself something. What company voluntarily shuts down 13,000 stores right in the middle of a massive economic recession? Sounds completely nuts, right? I mean, when businesses are strapped for cash, you'd expect them to keep the doors open as long as humanly possible. Yet, we're looking at an unprecedented, incredibly high-stakes decision made during a financial crisis that was already just gutting retailers left and right. And that brings us to the reality of that crazy decision. Picture this. It's before dawn on February 26, 2008. Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, makes the ultimate tough call. He decides to close every single U.S. store. And the signs on the doors? They didn't say out of business or under renovation. No, 13,000 stores just went completely dark, all at the exact same time. Schultz literally chose to surrender a full day of nationwide revenue. During a recession, remember? Because he was terrified the company had simply forgotten how to make espresso well. He halted the whole shebang to save the fading foundation of his brand. But why? Why go to that extreme? Well, to understand that drastic choice, we need to go to Section 1, the origin of the vision, and flashback to 1982. Over 2 decades ago, this empire didn't start with a green apron or a famous logo on every street corner. Actually, Howard Schultz was just hired as the director of retail operations for a small niche Seattle retailer that sold whole coffee beans and roasting equipment for home brewing. But the real turning point, that happens in 1983. Schultz takes a buying trip to Milan, Italy, and what he sees there totally rewires his brain. He doesn't just see people grabbing a quick drink. He sees baristas pulling shots of espresso with this amazing theatrical precision. He watches regulars lingering over conversation. It hits him. Coffee can be a third place. A familiar, comfortable space between work and home. A daily ritual. He comes back to America absolutely convinced that Starbucks shouldn't just be selling beans in a bag. They need to sell a gathering space. Now, the contrast in visions here is pretty stark. On one hand, you had the original Starbucks founders, Jerry Baldwin and Gordon Boker. Their vision was strictly 100% about selling high-quality beans for home brewing. On the other hand, you have Schultz's new vision, a vibrant Italian coffeehouse concept selling a community experience built around espresso drinks. So Schultz pitches this grand idea to the founders, and what do they say? They flatly reject him. Nope. They tell him no way. They just aren't interested in retooling the company they built around this crazy new concept. Which brings us to Section 2, the brutality of belief, and pitching il giornale. That initial rejection is a massive fork in the road for Howard Schultz, and he refuses to just quietly accept it. So in 1985, he leaves the company entirely. He decides to bet his whole career on starting his own espresso bar chain from scratch, called Il Giornale, built exactly on the vision that the Starbucks founders had just shot down. But look, believing in an idea and actually funding it, those are two very, very different things. Schultz had to take his business plan to investors, pitching an espresso bar in America. Keep in mind, most people at the time viewed this as an unnecessary luxury. Plus, he was a guy who used to sell drip coffee equipment. To get this off the ground, he had to pitch to 242 potential investors. It is just the brutal reality of trying to fund a totally unproven idea. And that leads us to this massive, kind of terrifying number. 217. I want you to just let that wall of rejection sink in for a second. 217 different investors looked Howard Schultz right in the eye and told him his idea was not worth the risk. They said no, flat out no. But he kept going anyway. He powered through all of that rejection and eventually managed to scrape together roughly $650,000, finally opening his doors in 1986. The sequence of events from there built into this incredible moment of poetic justice. We see his hiring in 82, his inspiration in 83, his departure in 85, and then boom, in 1987, Schultz actually buys Starbucks itself. The very company that had rejected his vision, he buys for $3.8 million. He merges it with Il Giornale, rebrands the whole thing under the Starbucks name, and suddenly, the man who refused to let his idea die is holding the checkbook.
From this moment on, an unparalleled, explosive global expansion begins.
But as we know, hyper expansion rarely comes without a cost, bringing us to Section 3, Growth versus Soul, and the real cost of expansion. As Starbucks races toward 13,000 locations through the early and mid-2000s, the company is opening stores at just an incredibly aggressive pace. And the strategy subtly shifts. It stops being primarily about serving customers well and starts being about occupying territory. I mean, they were literally opening new locations across the street from existing ones. This leads to a rather shocking moment. In 2007, an internal memo written by Schultz, who had actually stepped back from day-to-day leadership by this point, gets leaked to the public. And in it, he uses the words soulless and cookie cutter to describe what the stores had become. The founder, the guy who fought tooth and nail to build a brand around warmth and ritual, is privately admitting that relentless scaling has quietly broken the absolute core of the business. That internal rot eventually meets an external crisis. Let's look at Section 4, the hard reset and damage control.
By 2008, the global financial crisis is crushing consumer spending everywhere. The internal warning from that 2007 memo, it's now a glaring reality, forcing the company into hundreds of store closures. The once unstoppable growth story turns into a story of severe damage control, forcing Schultz to return as CEO. And this brings us right back to those radical counterintuitive actions he took. Think about these steps. First, he immediately cut 600 underperforming U.S. stores to trim the overextension. Second, he executes that shocking February 2008 shutdown of 13,000 locations for a whole afternoon. And third, he uses that exact time to retrain roughly 135,000 baristas on the fundamentals of making espresso correctly. He chose to halt everything and fix the foundation to protect the long-term brand, rather than just desperately chasing short-term sales.
And you know what? That massive gamble totally paid off. Just starkly contrast these two figures. Back in 2008, during the worst of the crisis and the closures, net earnings had completely collapsed to $315.5 million. But by returning to his core third-place strategy, stopping the bleeding, and retraining his staff, earnings rebounded to a then-record $945.6 million by fiscal 2010. Fixing the fundamentals literally tripled their net earnings in just 2 years. Tripled! However, it is very important to objectively note here that this isn't some perfectly clean redemption arc. We have to look at the whole picture. The turnaround had very real human costs. That aggressive overexpansion in the 2000s wasn't a victimless error, you know? It caused severe disruption. It diluted the in-store experience for millions of customers. And the subsequent closures deeply hurt frontline employees, who lost their jobs and their stores. Furthermore, consider the sheer scale of the pushback on the front lines, culminating in a massive $100 million settlement in 2009. The company had to pay this to resolve a class action lawsuit out in California over barista tip-sharing practices. It's a really potent reminder that fixing a massive brand at the top also required settling very real, serious disputes with the exact workers Schultz was relying on to slow down and retrain. The amazing comeback and the serious mistakes, they exist in the exact same picture.
So, what do we actually take away from all of this? Let's move into Section 5, Lessons Beyond the Coffee.
We want to distill the overarching lessons from this wild corporate life cycle so you can take these insights and apply them to your own endeavors, right? Whether you're building a business, leading a team, or just trying to get a huge idea off the ground. Here are the core takeaways. First, conviction survives rejection. 217 no's didn't make the idea wrong. Second, quality absolutely must pace with growth. Expansion without quality control is fatal. Third, bold leaders are willing to halt and retrain when things go off track. Fourth, you must sell experiences, not just products. Long-term loyalty comes from the feeling of a place, not just the item you buy. And finally, true leaders take responsibility. Schultz didn't just write a memo complaining about it. He returned to fix the problem himself. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. What idea of yours is waiting for its 218th conversation? The biggest brands are so often built on ideas that everyone else initially said no to. Don't let your unvalidated ideas die just because the people closest to you can't see the vision yet. If you enjoyed unpacking this incredible story with me today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive explainer. Keep learning, keep pushing forward, and I'll see you in the next one.